So we learned last week that nowadays um, there's a minhag to write v'hakol sharir v'kayam. So when they write v'hakol sharir v'kayam, there's nothing wrong with leaving blank space between the witnesses' signatures and the text, body of the text, because any shtar that doesn't have the words v'hakol sharir v'kayam at the very end of the shtar, you know that it may have been doctored with, and they may have added stuff at the end. And so therefore, it would be legitimate to add new material even towards the very end of the shtar, as long as you write v'hakol sharir v'kayam. Okay, so, and that's really why, by the way, when we cross out, let's say, something in a ketubah, and we write beneath the witnesses' signatures, we crossed out a line on line 6 of the ketubah, then we write v'hakol sharir v'kayam. You have to write that again at the very end of that addendum, so that it's clear that there's nothing that can be doctored with that statement. Okay? We don't initial them, but they make reference to line 6. What you do is you sign the shtar, and then you, below the witnesses' signatures, you say, please note that we crossed out a line, we crossed out a word in the ketubah and added in an extra word on such and such a line, v'hakol sharir v'kayam. And then the witnesses sign that on the bottom. So their signatures appear twice in a ketubah like that. Okay, so I'm just not sure. I don't think we did all of the. Okay, so let's see. So nowadays, if you don't write hakol sharir v'kayam, the shtar is considered to be pasul. So explains the Imrei Yaakov Kasav Hashach Devadai Kishabashtar Lefanenu Below Sharir v'kayam, that if a shtar came before us without the words hakol sharir v'kayam, v'anuroim shaha'idim chasumim miyad b'samach l'shtar ve'en kan shita chalak, and we see that the witness is signed very adjacent to the text, and there's been no blank line inserted. Shita dahashtar kasher, barak mishita achrona levad ein lameidin mimena. Then the shtar is still kosher. It's just that if there was anything added in the last line, we would not be able to admit that as a part of the terms of the deal. But the shtar is still kosher. In other words, it may be a malformed shtar, but b'di'evet it's a kosher shtar. So lameidin mishita achrona. Nowadays we can learn from the last line, and therefore you don't need to do a summation as long as you write v'hakol sharir v'kayam. Kevin she'en kasav sharir v'kayam lifnei shita zu. And if there was a line that came after v'hakol sharir v'kayam, we would know that there's a problem. And once you see that there's no see something written in the last line and then it says v'hakol sharir v'kayam at that point, so then you know it's legitimate. Ve'ein lomar dilma hayakasav shamu machako v'yichtov kiyam ha'mechika b'shita haba achrona v'yichtov b'sof sharir v'kayam. He says, what if, well, maybe I have to suspect that the way that they forged it is that they erased the words v'hakol sharir v'kayam that was originally at the end of the shtar. Then they added a new term, right? And then they wrote v'hakol sharir v'kayam at the end of that new term. He says, de'ein lachush lazeh. He says, that's something that we're not suspicious of. Mishum dehecha de'ika mechak b'mokom sharir v'kayam kaimelon da'ashtar pasel mehaitai magufa. He says, because if we can recognize that there's an erasure at the very end, he says, in a place where we would have anticipated them writing Hakol Sharir V'Kayam, then we would cast aspersions on the shtar, and we would not allow it to be upheld. And he writes in the footnote, "Umasha kosav kan harav shemakayim mechakim u'tluyim b'shita achrona, rotzalomar mechakim shenasu shelo b'makom shavir v'kayam." He says, if even if we find erasures in the last line, we can still validate the shtar, but not if it's at a place where we would have expected the words shavir v'kayam. Nahainu shelo b'sof shita echad lifnei sof hashtar, which would be not at, let's say, the last few words of the line that appears. In other words, let's say we're suspicious that something might have been doctored. So what we would do is we would look at the line before the last line and look at the end of that line. If there's an erasure there, where normally the words sharir v'kayam would be written, then we would say, okay, no, guys, this is not a good shtar. But if, let's say, there's an erasure of a small little letter at the bottom line of the shtar, then there's nothing wrong with that, is what's basically what he's saying. Okay. Shetoim limcha l'kayim achar sharir v'kayam. He says, and this is the problem, is that some people make a mistake that of a lo ka'otam shetoim l'kayim achar sharir v'kayam. He says, what you have to do is that if there is an erasure, something that was erased and something that was crossed out, or something that was inserted in afterwards, you have to do it. You have to write that this was done before the words sharir v'kayam. You have to make a notation of it, assuming that you're writing the shtar, and as you're writing the shtar, you make a mistake. Remember, like we learned last week. If it was written after the words sharir v'kayam, it's no good. But if they do write something after the final line, yakaimu v'yachzru v'yachtamu, then the witnesses have to sign a second time. That's the reason why I mentioned that in a ketubah, if the witnesses, if we notice that there's a mistake and we have to cross it out, so since the ketubah has already been written in its totality, it's already been completely filled in. So that's the reason why we can't, and it's printed b'hakol sharir v'kayam on the bottom of the ketubah. We have no choice but to let the witnesses sign, and then immediately below their signature, write that on line 6 there was something crossed out, b'hakol sharir v'kayam, and then have them sign again. He says, v'yachzru, right? That's what we're saying over here. V'yichtavu bazeh halashon, and they should write as follows: Teva ploni hu al hamechak, that there's such and such a word which is on an erased piece of parchment. O hu taloi o avar alav hakulmus, or let's say we say that there's a letter above the line or a word above the line that's taloi. O avar alav hakulmus, or ink has been placed over it. Vizu kiyuma, and this is our establishment of it. V'hakol sharir v'kayam. V'hainu im nasa hakiyum biyomo. And that's if they're let's say establishing the shtar's kashrus by pointing out the correction on that day. The ivlav hachi havale shtar mukdam, because if they don't do it on that self same day, then you have a problem of a predated shtar. The point he's making is, if let's say there's a malformed shtar and you have to cross out words, and then the witnesses sign it, and then the next day you realize that you put the wrong name in the shtar, so then you can't go back and write. We refer you back to line 6 where we crossed out his name is not Henry, his name is Scott, right? Instead. And then we write v'zeh kiyuma, and we're now pointing out this correction, v'hakol sharir v'kayam. So then you have a problem, is that the shtar is a predated shtar. It's a predated promissory note. So then you'd have to write the whole thing all over again. And they also should make sure that they write the correction very close to the original signatures on the shtar. If there's a word that is written in parentheses because you want to take that word out, so instead of crossing it out, you put it in parentheses, that also has to be pointed out in the addendum to the shtar that you're writing up. So this is basically, I only learned about this whole process maybe, a couple of decades ago. I never knew how to fix a faulty ketubah, which you would just do the whole thing all over again. But this is useful, let's say, in a situation where the family has paid a couple $100 for a very artistic ketubah on ketubah.com, or they have a calligrapher, and we have to make a correction. So this is typically what we do. And a lot of time, I've had situations where the artist, the calligrapher, I had a situation, I'm not sure if it's more than once, where the calligrapher for the ketubah was the artist of the artwork, a bit of a prima donna, And so you're going to do what? You're going to write on the bottom of this beautiful piece of artwork? How can you do that? So, you have to maneuver sometimes. Okay. Anyway, let us go to the next halacha. Lamed Beis. Utzrichim ha'edem ledaktik b'chatimatam shelo yarchikum mehaktav rochav beis shitin ein va'aviran. So the witnesses also have to be sure that when they sign the bottom of the shtar, they should try their best to minimize the amount of blank space between their signatures and the body of the text. And they should certainly not allow it to be more than 2 lines distance. Kigon, lamed b'shita ha'elyona v'chaf b'shita ha'tachtona she'ein bet shitin. In other words, let's say the witnesses want to allow for space for letters that go above and below the line. So let's say the bottom line of the body of the text has a langa chaf or a langa nun, a chaf sofit or a nun sofit. And so they want to, and my signature has a lamed. My name is Yisrael. So I have a lamed, and I want to make sure that the top of my lamed doesn't crisscross over the nun sofit or the chav sofit. So he says, okay, so we can allow up to 2 lines to allow for that not to overlap. Okay, the gimel avirim. So it's so shehein beit shitin v'gimel avirim. It's sort of like 3. Not sure what he means. What he means is usually in between each line there's a small amount of blank space. So this is 2 lines and 3 blank spaces, meaning the normal blank space that you leave between one line and another. So that much you can leave, but you shouldn't leave more than that. The imherchiku kol kach hashtar pasol. He says, but if there's more than that amount of distance, then the shtar is not kosher. If they shiyochol lezayef elichtov mashiyirtza b'shita rishona mibet shitot elu lachzu minyanu shel shtar b'shita achrona. He says, because, think about it, you could fill in, if there's a big space in between the body of the text and the signatures, who knows what could have been filled into that blank space. And you could even do a whole summation at the end. If you have 2 full lines that you could fill in, you could do a summation, and then you could make it look like this is part of the original shtar. Ba'afilu kasav sharir v'kayam b'siyum hashtar yachol l'mochko l'kayim hamachak b'shita shelifnei achrona v'yachsav yichtov sharir v'kayam b'shita achrona. And even if you say, well, what are you going to do with the words v'hakol sharir v'kayam? He says, well, that they could have erased that in the original last line, and then continued writing more terms in the bottom, and then they have a whole other line to say, oh, and by the way, these words were written over an erased part of the parchment, and everything is binding, provided my wife agrees. The hakol sharir v'kayam, right? And so, change the whole term of the deal. Ma she'enkin kishlo hirchiku ela kedei shita echat im yimchok sharir v'kayam shebesiyam hashtar v'yichtov ma sheyirtza b'shita achrona v'yachsav v'yichtov sharir v'kayam ein lamedu mikiyam hamachak shenitkaim b'shita achrona hol v'hamachak gadol kishir sharir v'kayam. He says, if, however, there's only 1 line between the witness's signature, one blank line that you can write, you can fill in between the last line and the witnesses' signatures, then you don't have to worry, because there wouldn't be enough space to change the terms of the deal in that one line, and then also to write, and the certain words were written on an erasure, and then to write the Hakol Sharir V'Kayim. There's just not enough space to do all of that in just one line. He says, V'yesh lachush shekol adam yasa kein limchok Sharir V'Kayam shebesiyam ashtar lo osif shita achat. He says, and then we would have to worry any time we have a shtar that a person erased the words V'Hakol Sharir V'Kayam, added a line, and then wrote V'Hakol Sharir V'Kayam again. He says, because you can never arrange for the witnesses. It's too difficult to compel the witnesses to really, really align their signatures without having some blank space. It's just not practical. And therefore he says, so therefore he says, it's not reasonable to be worried that if there's one blank line, that they're going to point out the correction, that there was some erased parchment, and then to write again Sharir V'Kayam. Below Amru Shemekayim Hamachak B'Shita Achrona Ela Kishenu Gadol Kishir Sharir V'Kayam Oshina B'Mak B'Shoy Liot Bo Sharir V'Kayam. And as the Imrei Yaakov had said in the previous on his previous commentary, that you can have an erasure on the last line of the shtar, but it can't be in a place. First of all, it can't be such a large erasure that you could fit the words Sharir V'Kayam, and it can't be in the place where we would have expected Sharir V'Kayam to appear. If that happens, and we see it's on the second to last line of the shtar, so then we get suspicious, and we will not validate a shtar like that. Okay, let's go take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. This is sort of, we're doing a lot of these details. I'm trying to run through them quickly because a lot of this is not so practical. We'll do the Imrei Yaakov, the daktek b'chatimatam, v'chol echad me'ha'edim chotem b'tchilat hashura. Each witness has to sign his signature at the beginning of the line. In other words, when you arrange for the witness signatures, you're supposed to arrange a new line for each witness's signatures. Some ketubah artists do not allow for that, but normally a ketubah artist that knows what they're doing will have two lines, one for each witness. If it's not at the beginning of the line, but let's say you center the two lines for their signatures, but at least as long as one is below the other, it's kosher. He says, but if, let's say, they sign adjacent to each other, it could be at times that this will be puzzle. Now, what does he mean by that? Lifa'amim hu pasul. We're not going to get into it now, but apparently there could be situations where this is not kosher. Let me just see. He says, I refer you to Siman Mem Hey Sif Yud. So let's take a look quickly at Siman Mem Hey Sif Yud. Just take a quick look at the Sefaria. Siman Mem Hey Sif Yud. One long name. Yeah. So he writes like this. Let's take a look. There is one that says that if the document finished in the middle of a line and they left that line and another line and then began signing on the third line, the document is invalid because a party can write what he wants on that half line and then recap the substance of the document on the last line. Similarly, if they finish the document at the end of a line and the witnesses distanced the full line and then began in the middle of the second line, the document is invalid if they signed one after the other on that half line, because a party can write so-and-so borrowed a mana from so-and-so on the empty half line before the signature, and the document would be one which has the text and witnesses on the one line which is valid, and the party will cut off the entire top of the document. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the next one. If there is a blank space before the witnesses' signatures, they must be careful to sign one after the other on the same line. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. So it is this. If the star if the last line of the star finishes in the middle of the line, and then they leave that half line blank, and then they leave another line blank before the witnesses sign, he says, then that's a problem. He says, because even 1.5 lines of blank space gives them enough room to doctor it and fill in additional stuff. והרחיקו העדים שיטה שלמה והתחילו העדים באמצע שיטה שנייה פסול, ויחתמו זה אחר זה באותו חצי שיטה שיכול לכתוב בחצי השיטה החלק, שלפני חתימתן פלוני לווה מפלוני מנה ויש דרבהו ועדה בשיטה. Okay. Basically what he's saying is that the reason why there's a concern if they sign side by side is that you could theoretically have someone, in the event that they indent their signatures and then they sign one next to the other, you could theoretically give someone room to doctor the document. Okay, so I guess the Imrei Yaakov just didn't want to get into it, but basically, as a general rule, you should always have the witnesses sign at the beginning of the line. And he also says, I refer you to Even HaEzer, Kuf Lamed Sif Beis. So this is also, you see, it's interesting. There are 2 places in the Shulchan Aruch where this appears. It appears in Choshen Mishpat, and it also appears in Even HaEzer in the laws of writing a ketubah, 130b. Even HaEzer 130b. But this is actually the laws of a get. Here, let me share the screen. He shall start at the beginning of a line. No blank space shall be left in the margin before their signatures. And that is, of course, because you want to make sure that no one is doctoring the document. Okay. When a witness signs, he needs to write his name and his father's name. Kigon Yosef ben Yaakov Eid. Kasav Yosef Eid Levado, O ben Yaakov Eid, O Yosef ben Yaakov, Elo Kasav Eid Kasher. If b'di'evet, a person just wrote his first name, and he said, and then afterwards he wrote Eid. Or let's say he wrote Ben Yaakov without writing his first name, just his father's name, and he wrote Eid. Or let's say he writes Yosef ben Yaakov, and he forgets to write the word Eid. In all cases, that's kosher. Aval chatam Yosef levad beli aviv velo chatam Eid pasul. Well, let's say he just writes Yosef, and he doesn't write the word Eid afterwards. So then the shtar is pasul. Begam im tevad Eid mutfas velo nichtav b'chtav yad sage. But it's also acceptable, let's say, if a blank line is provided, and at the end of the blank line, the word Eid is printed, that's also okay. That's what our ketubas have. You also don't necessarily have to have the word ne'um, which means the word of, and then the signature. Im chatam shemo b'shem mishpachta v'lo katav shem aviv efshar demo'il, u'mikol makom mehanachon lichtov eid. And again, of course, obviously what we're concerned about is that the signature will be doctored. What if I wrote Yosef Aid? Or let's say I just write Yosef. Well, there's a whole bunch of Yosefs. A person could doctor that and find another Yosef who's willing to perjure himself and write Yosef instead of Yosef ben Yaakov. He says Yosef ben Shimon, right? So you have to have the word aid afterwards so that seals off the Yosef so that it can't be doctored by anybody else. If a person just writes his first name and his family name, Yosef Schwartz, okay, and he doesn't write his father's name, that sometimes he says it could be that that's okay. But it would be preferred in that case to at least write aid after the name Schwartz. O Ploni ben Ploni shaz ein sarach aid. But if you write Ploni ben Ploni, if you write Yosef ben Yaakov, so then you don't even have to write the word aid. Ulam kama migdolei haposkim hakadmonim svilu de bishar shtos afilu biksuva ein sarach lichtov aid afilu lechatchila v'sagi bishmo b'shem aviv rak beget yesh lahakbid lechatchila. There are many poskim who say that you don't have to write the word aid on a regular star. You just write Ploni, the son of Ploni, and that's sufficient. And the only time that we require the witnesses to actually put the word aid at the end of their name is with a get and not with other documents. So there's room for leniency in many instances. But the standard format is to say so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, aid witness. Okay, we'll continue this in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow.